Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. There is a crisis in Europe. It's been in place and building at least since the Obama administration's so-called reset policy in 2009, a breakdown of trust between Washington and Moscow. Larger story. There's been a crisis in Europe since the end of the Soviet Union. The 3 times elected president of the Soviet Union, now Russian Federation, is Vladimir Putin, who has said, paraphrasing, the failure of the Soviet Union was one of the, if not the tragedy of the 20th century. He is now the 3rd time elected president. He has supervised and built the Sochi Games now underway. But in the meantime, and perhaps this is how history works, there is a burning hole in the former Soviet Union. It's Ukraine. It's part of the story of failure, success, and failure since the end of the Soviet Union. During the 1990s and right up until now, Ukraine has been a state that is critical to the tradition and to the future of Moscow, of the Kremlin. Joining me now to tell this story, the whole story, including the crisis now with the standoff in Independence Square, men with weapons, it's reported, and armor and plans for violence are parked out, encamped in winter conditions. And surrounding them in this Soviet-era construction architecture are the police waiting for orders when to impose, once again, law and order on Kiev and throughout Ukraine. Steve Cohen, a Russian history professor at New York University, and he has a new piece going up in The Nation within hours, but we can preview it here because Steve addresses himself to the American people and how they've been misinformed by the American media, at least most recently over Ukraine, but really for a long time about Russia and its place in the 21st century. Steve, a very good evening to you. I begin with Kiev, with this so-called standoff in Independence Square. The gangsters, the mobsters, the thugs, I don't know how else to characterize men who use such rubbishy language that isn't being reported to the American media. Since you pointed it out to me more than a week ago, Steve, I've done my investigation. These are people we would have called skinheads if they were in Germany. Why are the American people not being told the facts? Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, has complained out loud. Is there an explanation? Good evening to you, Steve.
Hi, John. It's a tragedy unfolding in Ukraine. And let's find time, if we can tonight, to talk about the geopolitical aspects of it.
Correct.
But on a personal level, some people have asked, is this a revolution unfolding in Ukraine? A real revolution? It's not that yet. But what history tells us is that when a revolution unfolds, its first victims are the moderates. Now let's flash back to November when all this began. Remember, protesters formed in the streets of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, to protest the president, Viktor Yanukovych's decision not to sign an economic partnership agreement with the European Union, and instead take a large loan to save the Ukrainian economy, which is on the verge of collapse, from Putin of Russia. And protesters formed in the streets demanding that Yanukovych join Europe, not Russia. The leaders of those protesters were, by any reasonable definition, at least 2 of the 3 of them, moderate men, including the former heavyweight boxing champion of the world, Vitaly Klitschko. And they were moderate. They talked about democracy, they talked about European values, they talked about peaceful evolution to democracy and market reforms, and all the good things. But as the crisis deepened, they lost control of the hundreds of thousands of people in the streets in Kiev, tens of thousands of whom are still there. And slowly there emerged, out of the shadows, something that's been in Ukraine for years and years, was there during World War II because it collaborated with Nazi Germany during the war when Germany occupied the Ukraine. People who might reasonably be called neo-fascist. In what sense? That they have a cult of blood, pure Ukrainian. They hate people of color. They hate Jews. They hate homosexuals. They don't even like European values. And they hate Russia, too. And these people who were marginal have slowly emerged as the kind of armed detachment of the protesters. The best-known group is called the Right Sector. G-H-T. It doesn't, I don't know whether it means geography on the right or it means correct. But they call themselves Pravi Sector, right sector. And they have emerged as a very articulate group, a very armed group, a very tough group, a very fierce-looking group. As you say, they have skinned heads, tattoos, they carry crowbars, sometimes guns, different kinds of weapons. And many of them have spread to western Ukraine, where they've been occupying government buildings. So what we now have is this kind of the center cannot hold, and the extremists on both sides begin to emerge on the barricades. Now, what are the extremists on the other side? That would be on the side of Viktor Yanukovych, the elected president. He has offered a compromise. He offered the moderates a coalition government. He offered the moderates the prime ministership and deputy prime ministership. He offered to change the Constitution to give Parliament more power. But it was rejected by the moderates because they can't control the protesters in the streets anymore. So what's happened in Yanukovych's government camp? Increasingly, we hear from the army calls for a state of emergency, or what we would call martial law. That is, going out and the shedding of blood to drive these people out of the streets and put an end to what is now a 3-month siege of Kiev and the growing partition of Ukraine. And there's where things now stand, except, again, one other element. The West, Washington, Brussels, the Obama administration, the European Union, are deeply involved. Their representatives are on the streets telling people what to do and what not to do. So they become a kind of third factor in this combustible mix. And as we talk tonight, and consistent with what you just reported, that's where things stand.
I want to drive the point that the people in the square right now, under army tents, used army tents, camped out, making threats, and some of them are carrying weapons. It's reported within these last 2 days. These men are chiefly looking for a fight, Steve. They're looking to spill blood. One of them, the leader, is Ole Tyanibuk from Lvov. And he, 45 years old, he's a member of government. He represents the Western Ukraine. But this is a man who 70 years ago would be called a fascist. That's what we would call him, and we'd dismiss
him. Let's back up. As the neo-fascists go in Ukraine, I don't know how to put this. I don't know whether we say he's a moderate neo-fascist or he isn't a neo-fascist, but he's very extreme. He has a long history of anti-Semitic statements. And Israel, on more than one occasion, has filed official protest because this man is, as you say, a member of the parliament, against his utterances. So he has an anti-Semitic reputation, but because he's been standing in Kiev alongside John McCain, right, and alongside representatives...
In mid-December, he stands beside the senior senator from Arizona.
That's right, and along officials from the European Union. He's kind of chilled out. He personally has dropped this language, but his followers in the street have not. But here's what's interesting. He's lost control, too, of the street. They consider him a sellout, too moderate. That's why I say that the moderates are the first victims when a revolutionary situation develops. And you're left with extreme resolutions on each side of the barricade. And the question is, which will prevail? Now, to come back, you say these people, I haven't been in Kiev, but your reporter sounds like, the reports sound accurate,
yes,
that these thugs, let's call them that, or thuggish people, are itching for violence. But there's a reason for this. They know, and they're taught, that if you can provoke the police into bloodshed while the television cameras are rolling, those images, particularly when broadcast to the West, but also in the country, will build sympathy for the people the police are attacking, even if the police are defending themselves. We've now got nearly a month of these thugs throwing Molotov cocktails for the younger generation who doesn't know what that is. That's a firebomb. It's a bottle of kerosene with a lit rag in it. And when it explodes, it's a firebomb. Been throwing these at police. That would not, by the way, that would not be tolerated in any Western democracy.
Nor is it tolerated in Moscow. And I want to speak to Moscow next, Steve. I want to bring Vladimir Putin into this theater piece because the larger story here is a breakdown of trust between Washington and Moscow. You mentioned John McCain, but there are members of the State Department that have been encouraging the protest in Independence Square and not taking responsibility for what's happened right now. I'm John Batchelor. I'll be back with Steve Cohen of New York University, and we'll speak of Vladimir Putin and his conversations with President Yanukovych within these last days at Sochi. I'm John Batchelor.